the British Army of the Victorian era. We've seen it depicted in many films. Perhaps we've read the Flashman books. But what is the reality? Was it an outdated institution, or in fact a progressive, forward-thinking one, brimming with fresh ideas? Well, in today's video I'm speaking to the one and only Ian Knight, author of dozens of books on the army of the era. He's going to explain why the army was initially slow to reform, but then what the catalysts were that really help it to move forward and develop, and particularly how it was forced to adapt in the face of Britain's growing empire and the enemies that they faced. We're also going to look at the gradual phasing out of those iconic red or scarlet coats that had defined the British infantryman for centuries.
In many ways, it was stagnant at the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign. It was still a very sort of hidebound institution. There was a huge gulf between the officer class, who were drawn very much from principally actually from the sort of minor landed gentry. It's slightly a myth that there were a lot of aristocrats in the British Army at this period. There certainly were some. Some of them, like Lord Cardigan, for example, were quite eccentric and left their mark.
I am aware you are drinking porter at my table.
But generally, it was the sort of lower gentry who provided the officers, and then the rural or urban poor who provided the other ranks. That was pretty much as it had been in Napoleonic times, and there wasn't much of a bridge between the two. For the ordinary soldier, it was very much a life of harsh routine, of constant drill, of fairly harsh authority. That hadn't changed since the Napoleonic Wars at all. Battlefield tactics hadn't changed since the Napoleonic Wars. And yes, the figure that towers over the reason behind that is the Duke of Wellington, who of course had won Waterloo in 1815, but then gone on to be hugely influential in British society and British government subsequently. His career doesn't stop with his victory at Waterloo. He dominates the British military scene and the military establishment. And of course, a lot of the field commanders during the early Victorian period are officers who had served under the Duke of Wellington in the Peninsula or at Waterloo. But what would the Duke of Wellington say? Very much kind of dominated military thought through to the eve of the Crimean War. And only with his death do you begin to get sort of significant changes.
Do you see a specific moment or specific incidents that make the top brass go, we need to change? Or is it from the bottom up? What do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because in lots of ways, of course, the popular view is that the Crimea is the catalyst for change. The British Army went into it as a recognisably Napoleonic institution, still wearing the same sort of bright uniforms, still adopting broadly the same sort of battlefield tactics. But of course, it comes at a point when weapon technology has changed. You've then got rifled muskets, so the capacity for longer range destruction on the battlefield is much greater at that point. But really, in a way, what changes with the Crimea is not so much that it's the shortcomings of the war itself, which are not hugely different from earlier Napoleonic wars. But the fact that media coverage is much greater. So you've got sort of almost embedded journalists like William Howard Russell who are reporting on what's going on. And there's a sort of growth in literacy or growth in influence from the literate middle class. The arrival from the 1840s of illustrated papers, which are presenting these wars in new ways. And the British public just becomes more aware of what's going on in the Crimea. And that, of course, is really the catalyst for change.
But Ian's latest book doesn't just focus on the big European wars. In fact, there's a lot of information about the wars in New Zealand against the Maoris and in South Africa against the Xhosa people in the frontier wars.
Generally, these wars are remembered in their own countries, but are largely forgotten here in the UK. And yet, to my mind, these are the campaigns when the British, rather falteringly, often enough, are learning the craft of kind of colonial warfare, which they sort of have got the knack of by the time you get to the 1870s and the 1880s, when you get these much bigger wars around the world, which are, you know, more kind of remembered today. But the smaller ones and the difficulties of just getting somewhere in the world to fight, finding when you get there that the terrain is very different from anything you've experienced before, working out how you're going to move yourself across that, and then fighting enemies who are very effective on their own turf in their own terms. From the British perspective, the British have then got it's another different enemy fighting in a different way that we've somehow got to learn to come to terms with. And one of the things, and it's in a sense, it's just a little point, but it's sort of emblematic of the whole process that I'm looking at in the book. On the Cape frontier there, one of the Highland regiments, the 74th Highlanders, adopts a sort of proto-khaki uniform for fighting in the bush. Their colonel adopts, I think they were actually sort of loose smocks that were issued for life on board ship on the way out to Southern Africa. And he had them dyed with local dyes. So you've got this very sort of practical, loose, khaki coloured coat that instead of the scarlet that everybody else is still wearing, his men are then using in the bush. And it seems to me, well, there's the cutting edge of that sort of process that's going on over the whole period. You're moving out of a whole type of warfare and into something new around the world.
It's these campaigns that really helped to shape the development of the army. But with all this experience, was it leading to a change in the tactical doctrine of the army, or were individual commanders forced to reinvent the wheel time and time again?
Yeah, I think there is an element of inventing the wheel. It is this imperial experience around the world where the British are having to learn all these new sort of techniques. And the Crimea, unfortunately, in a sense, sort of sets things back because there's a feeling of, this is the sort of war that we're up to fighting. That's great. Let's study how the war was carried out in a European sort of sense and concept and all the rest of it. And once again, this growing body of colonial experience is sort of pushed into the background. In India, shortly afterwards, obviously, you've got this major conflict where there is a challenge to the East India Company rule, the Indian Mutiny, First War of Indian Independence, however you want to style it these days, which again is it's interesting in some ways from a sort of strategic and tactical point of view, because it straddles both worlds. On one hand, it's very clearly a colonial campaign, but on the other hand, you're fighting against Indian troops who had been trained in British techniques, and a lot of it is fairly sort of conventional warfare. So there's definitely a kind of angst running through the British Army at this period as to what our direction should be and what should we learn from these colonial campaigns. And there was a feeling that the colonial campaigns were small wars, in inverted commas, and therefore really not that significant. And yet my argument is actually, no, that's where the British are going around the world at this point, and they were hugely significant. I did want consciously to try and bring some of these forgotten stories to the fore, because they ought to be remembered today. They're quite extraordinary in terms of the human experience, and let's not forget about them.
So I just want to interrupt for one moment to make two announcements. One, my t-shirts are for sale. See the link in the description. There's some really cool designs like these on screen now. And two, if you're interested in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, please sign up for my mailing list, the newsletter, over at redcoathistory.com/newsletter. Again, link in the description below. And when you do so, you'll get a free copy of my short ebook all about the Battle of Isandlwana. All right, guys, let's get back to Ian.
How do you see the biggest changes in the army over this period?
The army, certainly during the Napoleonic era, had recruited very heavily in Ireland. And it certainly does throughout the 1830s. But that begins to drop off in the 1840s with the famines in Ireland, the potato blight and all the rest of it, where you start to get a huge immigration from Ireland actually to America. And there are less young men in Ireland sort of seeking an escape from that society by joining the British Army, and it begins to drop away throughout the 19th century, and there's much more emphasis on recruiting in the cities. The recruiting sergeants are on record as saying, well, generally we preferred a ploughboy as a recruit because they were fit and strong, and they took rather better to discipline than the rather undernourished, I suppose, a bit bolshy, urban slum dwellers who they recruited as well. And so you get that sort of shift is going on in the background. Initially, life is pretty harsh for ordinary soldiers. It hasn't changed much from Napoleonic times at the beginning of the period, but there is a growing awareness, a growing interest in the welfare of ordinary soldiers. And so, as you say, you start to get a rise in educational standards. It's quite small at this period, but in the later period, later Victorian period, it does become quite significant. By the time you get to the 1870s, a lot more soldiers were literate than they were in the 1830s, for example. There's a realization that perhaps keeping your soldiers happy with huge amounts of beer at, you know, whatever it was, a halfpenny court or something, isn't necessarily long-term very good for the welfare of the army. So you start to get a temperance movement to encourage people away, soldiers away from just drinking their pay at the end of the month. And all of these sort of slowly start to shift towards a better educated, a better treated sort of ordinary soldier in the period there. And the shift, as I say, away from Ireland towards ordinary kind of urban poor as the principal recruiting era. So it's not always obvious, but it's definitely going on in the background. And it kind of culminates, you mentioned the Cardwell report reforms, which really sort of get into gear in the 1870s. So I sort of stop the book on the cusp of that with a nod to the fact that that's where we're going. Altering the way that soldiers were recruited, the period that they were recruited for, there was an emphasis on a new sort of short system rather than effectively signing up for life. You could sign up for a period and then kind of go on to the reserve afterwards, which was thought to make it more attractive to a better class of recruit, was the phrase that was used at the time. So there are sort of changes brewing and kind of coming to a head at the end of the period here, which make it quite a different institution to the one that the Duke of Wellington had presided over and won the Battle of Waterloo with.